The president of El Salvador frequently gloats about his administration's 2019 security campaign, which has resulted in a 95% reduction in the nation's homicide rate between its inception and 2024. These results are achieved through a program that modernized the country's police and military, introduced social programs aimed at reducing youth involvement in organized crime, and implemented a mass incarceration campaign. In 2022, the administration escalated these efforts by declaring a state of exception, leading to the suspension of many of the nation's constitutional protections, including due process. This campaign has resulted in the incarceration of around 80,000 individuals. However, without due process or habeas corpus protections, it is estimated that as many as 10% of these individuals were wrongfully imprisoned. President Bukele himself confirmed that around 8,000 people have been erroneously detained, but have since been released, at least according to him. The alleged success of Bukele's Territorial Control Plan has emboldened the self-proclaimed dictator to weigh in on Mexico's own internal security issues via social media, writing on Twitter, 28 of 32 states have a population equal or less than El Salvador's. Why then can't they solve the security issue in a single state with less inhabitants? Bukele seemingly believes that the challenges faced by the world's largest and most populous Spanish-speaking nation are comparable to those of his small Central American territory. This couldn't be further from the truth. There is a stark contrast between the organized, well-funded, deeply embedded, and often American-backed criminal syndicates that plague Mexico and the street gangs that El Salvador inherited from the United States. The operational environments of both nations are vastly different. The challenges they face are not remotely similar, and any comparison reveals that El Salvador is effectively operating on easy mode, made even easier by a willingness to violate civil rights in pursuit of their goals. Still, does he have a point? To answer that, we must consider the broader context and examine the conditions under which each country operates. Mexico's organized crime problem has existed for decades, but the situation escalated dramatically in 2006 with the initiation of the Mexican drug war by then-President Felipe Calderón. Prior to the war's launch, Mexico was beginning to see a decline in violent crime, with the national homicide rate dropping from 11 per 100,000 in 2000 to 9.7 in 2006, hitting a low point of 8 in 2007. However, Calderón's war led to a drastic increase in violence as the destruction of smaller cartels and the fracturing of large ones created power vacuums that exacerbated violence across the country. By the end of Calderón's presidency, homicides had surged to 22.1 per 100,000. And that homicide rate remained in the 20s, which often draws criticism from outside commentators who fail to consider the context behind the ongoing conflict. Because while it's true that Calderón initiated the war against the cartels, his motives have been questioned over the years. His victory over AMLO in the 2006 election was marred by controversy, with various irregularities casting doubt on the legitimacy of the results. Some have speculated that Calderón launched the war in order to appear as a wartime president and thereby legitimize his presidency. His administration was also rife with corruption, as evidenced by his Secretary of Public Safety, Genaro Garcia Luna, who was later shown to have accepted bribes from organized crime. And despite Calderón's denials, evidence suggests his administration disproportionately targeted the Beltran Leyva, Zetas, and Tijuana cartels while allowing the Sinaloa cartel to expand its territory relatively unopposed. In short, although Calderón attempted to legitimize his presidency through the drug war, his selective targeting of certain cartels may have hindered actual progress by enabling others, like Sinaloa, to grow stronger. When President Peña Nieto took office, he attempted to shift the narrative by distancing himself from the militarized rhetoric of his predecessor. He emphasized reducing violence through economic and structural reforms. However, despite the change in tone, his administration experienced a dramatic increase in violence, with 2018 registering some of the highest levels since the war began. Militarization under Peña Nieto continued, including the creation of a national gendarmerie, but corruption remained a major obstacle. During the trial of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, multiple witnesses testified that Peña Nieto accepted tens of millions of dollars in bribes. Meanwhile, local police forces in states like Guerrero, Veracruz, and Tamaulipas were frequently exposed for colluding with cartels. The 2014 disappearance of 43 students particularly implicated local police, the military, and federal authorities in either the act itself or a cover-up. These events highlight how years of inaction and collusion allowed the cartels to entrench themselves in Mexican society and accumulate significant political influence. So much so that some cartels have operated with impunity, while rivals were selectively targeted. The election of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, marked a significant shift in the security strategy encapsulated by the slogan, Abrazos, no balazos, hugs, not bullets. This approach sought to address crime by tackling the social conditions that lead to people joining criminal organizations. AMLO's administration focused funding on social programs aimed at reducing poverty, unemployment, a lack of education. Under his leadership, the minimum wage nearly doubled. Real wages increased by roughly 30%, and the income of the bottom 10% of earners surged by nearly 99%. An estimated 5.1 million Mexicans were lifted out of poverty. This strategy correlated with a modest reduction in homicides, a 0.4% drop in 2020, 4.6 in 2021, 7.1 in 2022. Between 2018 and 2023, the overall homicide rate decreased by 15%. And despite this progress, the absolute number of killings remained high compared to previous administrations. But AMLO's approach wasn't without its flaws. While it tackled the root causes of cartel recruitment, it lacked aggressive measures. His administration maintained an unofficial but evident policy discouraging armed forces from direct engagement with criminal groups. Security forces were instructed to avoid high-risk operations unless success was guaranteed with minimal casualties. In cartel-dominated areas, they were tasked more with maintaining order than initiating conflict. This led to accusations that the government was effectively tolerating cartel control. AMLO's defenders argued that violence breeds more violence, and that previous administrations had failed by focusing too much on force and not enough on the social dimensions of the problem. His solution was to dry up cartels' recruiting pool by improving quality of life and expanding opportunity. However, by 2022, it became apparent that this approach alone wasn't enough. The government began expanding the National Guard to over 120,000 troops and increasing deployments to hotspots like Michoacán, Zacatecas, and Guerrero. Mexico also took steps to further militarize, transferring oversight of key infrastructure projects from civilian to military control. In the end, the strategy did produce a decline in homicides, albeit a modest one, but it failed to substantially weaken cartel structures. Addressing Mexico's failures in tackling organized crime only tells a part of the story. Mexico, after all, doesn't exist in a vacuum. One of the major challenges it faces is that the cartels are extremely well armed, sometimes more so than local police. In some instances, groups like the Sinaloa cartel or CJNG possess firepower comparable to that of the Mexican military, although not quite equal. Mexico's gun laws are very strict, and most of the weapons used by the cartels are not even available for legal purchase inside the country. Instead, they are trafficked in from the United States, where gun laws are much looser. Weapons like AR-15s, AK variants, and even 50 caliber sniper rifles are easily available in many US states. The combination of these relaxed regulations and the porous border gives rise to what is known as the Iron River, the steady flow of weapons from the US to Mexico. Many states do not require universal background checks, meaning that private sales between individuals often go unmonitored. Cartels exploit this loophole by employing U.S. citizens to purchase firearms on their behalf, a tactic known as a straw purchase, where someone legally buys a firearm for someone else to avoid paperwork or restrictions. These weapons are stored in the US in safe houses and later smuggled across the border, often with the help of American citizens. According to the ATF and the US Government Accountability Office, about 70% of firearms recovered at Mexican crime scenes originated in the United States. Mexican officials put the figure closer to 80%, citing that nearly 1 million firearms entered Mexico from the US between 2000 and 2019. Despite knowing this, the US government has done little to disrupt these trafficking networks. In fact, things arguably got worse after the 1994 assault weapons ban expired in 2004. Its expiration led to a surge in weapon availability across the border states and a 45% rise in gun-related homicides in Mexico between 2005 and 2009. And the ATF only added further damage in 2009 with Operation Fast and Furious, which allowed straw buyers to purchase firearms under surveillance with the goal of tracking them into Mexico to cartel leaders. The result? 1,400 firearms went missing, and many have since turned up in Mexican crime scenes with no high-profile cartel arrests to show for it. The Iron River and America's failure to stem it is only one aspect of the broader issue. While U.S. officials frequently criticize Mexico for its failure to dismantle cartels, American agencies have played a significant role in empowering them. As mentioned earlier, the Fast and Furious debacle helped arm criminal groups. But perhaps more egregiously, a 2014 investigation by the Mexican newspaper El Universal revealed that the DEA and the Department of Justice had secretly collaborated with the Sinaloa cartel. Based on unsealed U.S. court documents, interviews with anonymous sources within Mexico's Attorney General's office, U.S. law enforcement whistleblowers, and Mexican intelligence officials, the investigation alleged that U.S. authorities struck a deal with the Sinaloa cartel and allowed them to traffic drugs into the United States in exchange for intelligence on rival cartels. This informal arrangement gave the Sinaloa cartel a strategic advantage, allowing it to become the dominant trafficking force in the region and effectively sabotaging binational efforts to dismantle trafficking networks. So to recap Mexico's situation, Mexico's long struggle to rein in cartels is the consequence of decades marked by government inaction, complicity from corrupt conservative administrations, and destructive interference by the United States. U.S. policies around arms trafficking and covert support for select cartels allowed these criminal groups to entrench themselves deeply, to the detriment of both Mexican sovereignty and security. With the historic election of Andrés Manuel López Obrador in 2018 and Dr. Claudia Sheinbaum in 2024, the Morena government shifted the nation's focus to addressing root causes of violence: poverty, limited education, and scarce economic opportunity. Through targeted social programs, Morena has lifted over 5 million Mexicans out of poverty and begun improving the quality of life for many. Importantly, Mexico has managed to reduce homicide rates, even if modestly, without resorting to authoritarian measures such as suspending constitutional protections. Instead, the government has taken steps to strengthen Mexican democracy by empowering citizens to elect top judicial officials rather than allowing political appointments that serve ruling interests. This marks a meaningful advance in Mexico's sovereignty and rule of law. We now turn our attention to the situation in El Salvador, a country facing serious challenges of its own, but whose circumstances are nowhere near comparable to those of Mexico. Despite the gravity of its internal issues, El Salvador's security crisis has been far less complex, less entrenched, and far more localized, and yet its president has taken to posturing online as though the solutions applied to his tiny nation should be copied wholesale by countries facing vastly more difficult circumstances. Before any such comparisons are entertained, it's necessary to dissect the reality of El Salvador's situation and expose the shallow nature of these misguided criticisms. And first, let's acknowledge that by no means should the threat posed by El Salvador's gangs be downplayed. Groups like MS-13 and 18th Street have terrorized local communities for years through violence, kidnapping, extortion, and the distribution and sale of drugs. These gangs have also shown the ability to mobilize their numbers to influence local politics, going so far as to sway elections and legislation, which adds political corruption to their long list of crimes. And the violence inflicted by these gangs led to some of the highest homicide rates in the world, 103 per 100,000 in 2014, and peaking at 106 per 100,000 in 2015. This is significant, especially when considering that such levels of violence were carried out by what are essentially street gangs, two of which originated in the United States, where they continue to exist, but hold nowhere near the same level of influence. Previous efforts by El Salvador to bring the gangs under control were largely ineffective. Arrests made under past government policies often led to the eventual release of suspects, and most strategies failed to meaningfully address extortion or other crimes committed against innocent civilians. Instead, many of these policies focused narrowly on suppressing homicide numbers rather than curbing gang violence in a broader sense. It's no wonder that by 2019, the people of El Salvador were desperate for any kind of reprieve, and that's when Bukele stepped in. Within 3 weeks of taking office in 2019, President Bukele introduced his Territorial Control Plan, which was designed to be implemented in multiple phases. Phase 1 of the program focused on deploying police and military forces to reclaim gang-controlled areas. This phase included increased foot patrols, expanded surveillance, mass arrests, raids on known gang houses, and the seizure of weapons and communications equipment. The government also worked to sever communications between imprisoned gang leaders and their foot soldiers still operating in the streets. At this early stage, arrests were largely targeted. Police and military units coordinated closely to identify and neutralize gang presence in key hotspots. The immediate effect was a significant drop in homicides, reaching some of the lowest rates the country had seen in over a decade. Phase 2 launched in July of 2020 and was supposed to expand the strategy into the social realm. It promised to introduce social spending aimed at boosting education, creating jobs, funding youth outreach, and launching community development programs to reduce gang recruitment. The plan outlined initiatives such as school renovations, scholarships, job training, and support for at-risk youth entrepreneurship. Unfortunately, these initiatives largely failed to materialize. Between 2019 and 2021, the government prioritized military recruitment, policing, and the purchase of military-grade equipment, often at the expense of community-focused social programs. By 2022, the administration had effectively abandoned the second phase, and instead it had veered into authoritarianism. A spike in gang violence in March of 2022 left 87 people dead in just 3 days and provided Bukele with the opportunity to declare a national emergency, and in a response, the government enacted the state of exception, suspending several key constitutional protections, including freedom of assembly, right to legal counsel, due process, habeas corpus, and detention time limits, which were extended from 72 hours to 15 days. And this was not just a policy shift, it was a clear turn towards authoritarian rule. Mass arrests followed, thousands were detained on suspicion of gang affiliation, often with little to no evidence or based solely on anonymous tips. Overcrowded prisons prompted the construction of Secot, a mega prison, which is now not only used to house Salvadorian prisoners, but also individuals deported from the United States under questionable circumstances. Estimates suggest that as many as 10,000 people were wrongfully detained under the state of exception. Bukele has publicly admitted to only around 8,000 wrongful arrests, many of who have, according to him, since been released, but without public transparency, who knows? On May 1st of 2021, after his Nueva Ciudad party secured a supermajority in the Legislative Assembly, Bukele's allies moved to remove all 5 magistrates of the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court, a blatant violation of the separation of powers. The ousted magistrates were then swiftly replaced with loyalists, effectively eliminating the court as a check on presidential power. With both the legislature and the judiciary under his control, Bukele then moved to dismantle presidential term limits. The Constitutional Chamber, newly packed with Bukele-aligned judges, issued a reinterpretation of Article 152 of the Constitution, allowing for the immediate re-election of a president. This maneuver circumvented the Constitution's original intent, which barred consecutive terms and required former presidents to wait a 10-year period before running again. Much of this went unopposed due to Bukele's consolidation of power, which included a judicial reform law passed in August of 2021 that lowered the retirement age of judges from 70 to 60, and this forced the early retirement of more than 200 judges, many of whom had been critical of the administration or were involved in corruption investigations against it. Their replacements, often appointed without proper vetting, were viewed as loyal to the president and cemented his control over the judiciary. After consolidating legislative and judicial power, Bukele was able to fully pursue his campaign of unchecked mass arrests, effectively removing gangs from the streets of El Salvador, but at the cost of the people's constitutional rights. This crackdown did lead to a drop sharp in homicides, but critics point out that homicide rates were already in steady decline prior to his turn towards authoritarianism. Following the collapse of the 2012 gang truce, El Salvador experienced peak violence between 2014 and 2015, with homicide rates reaching 103 and 106 per 100,000 respectively. However, between 2016 and 2018, those numbers had already begun to fall, with rates dropping to 84 per 100,000, 83, and finally 53 per 100,000. This trend suggests that the country was making progress without having to dismantle its democratic framework. Had Bukele stayed the course, continued targeted operations against gang members while investing in the promised social programs, he might have achieved security gains without plunging the nation into authoritarianism. Instead, Bukele chose power over principle, proudly referring to himself as a dictator on social media, embracing a label that many leaders would see as a stain on their legacy. So now let's go ahead and compare Mexico and El Salvador. Despite President Bukele's attempts to shame Mexico's effort in the drug war by drawing comparisons to his own Territorial Control Plan, the reality is that the situations faced by both nations are fundamentally incomparable. El Salvador has a population of around 6 million people spread across just over 21,000 kilometers squared. A small, densely populated country with a relatively centralized geography. While its gang crisis, particularly involving MS-13 and Barrio 18, pose a serious threat to internal security, these are still primarily street-level organizations. They lack international reach, complex logistical infrastructure, or significant influence over the federal government. Mexico, by contrast, is the 14th largest country in the world with an area of 1.96 million kilometers square and a population of 126 million. It must govern a far more diverse, mountainous and rural terrain, and secure borders with both the United States and Central America. The criminal organizations it faces, such as the Sinaloa Cartel and CJNG, operate as transnational enterprises with vast financial resources, military-grade firepower, and proven influence over political institutions at both the local and federal levels. To equate El Salvador's challenge with Mexico's is not only misleading, it's a fundamental misreading of scale, complexity, and the nature of the threat. While Bukele has indeed managed to lower crime rates in El Salvador, the way in which he accomplished this was through the violation of the civil and constitutional rights of the Salvadorian people. And he pursued this path despite homicide rates already trending downwards, suggesting that he could have continued with the original intent of his Territorial Control Plan and still achieved further reductions in violence. Instead, he chose the route of authoritarianism in the name of crime reduction. In contrast, Morena inherited a Mexico plagued by historic levels of violence fueled by decades of inaction, corruption, and administrations more concerned with optics and appeasing the United States than addressing the root cause of crime. While Morena's early strategy under AMLO left something to be desired in terms of enforcement, it still managed to reduce crime while improving the standard of living for millions of Mexicans. Unlike Bukele, Morena accomplished its goals without having to violate the civil or constitutional rights of its citizens. In fact, the party has worked to strengthen Mexican democracy, most notably by moving to allow people to elect their own judges, rather than having them appointed by the executive branch, which for decades allowed presidents to stack the judiciary with loyalists. In short, the strategies of the two nations are not only incomparable due to the difference in territorial size, their population, and the nature of the threats they face, but also in principle. When faced with crisis, one government chose to empower its people and strengthen democracy. The other chose to erode it. So let's finally address the question posed at the start. Does Bukele have a point? No. His comparison between Mexico and El Salvador is not just flawed, it's absurd. His conclusions are simplistic, shaped more by ego than by understanding. They stem from the myth he has carefully crafted around himself, one amplified by domestic sycophants and authoritarian apologists abroad, including segment of Mexico's own right wing who foolishly cry out, "We need our own Bukele." But Bukele's criticism reveals a shallow grasp of the scale, complexity, and geopolitical weight of Mexico's fight against organized crime. His commentary offers no real solutions, only self-promotion repackaged as bravado. He is selling the illusion of the strongman, a model built on the erosion of rights, the centralization of power, and the silencing of dissent. And while that may appeal to those who mistake cruelty for strength, it is no answer for a diverse, democratic, and globally significant nation like Mexico. It's not leadership, it's theater.